We're going through all of our things that we're going to be live streaming on. So we're live now. Good to see everyone. So what I want to do is, I thank you, Alana, for your flexibility in all of this. I've asked Alana just throughout these days. I'm kind of on vacation, which everybody who works for me on the creative side of things knows that's dangerous. When I'm on vacation, the ideas and the juices start flowing. I start thinking more. Believe it or not, I think more on vacation, and I just get creative, right? So, Alana, thank you for jumping on. So, I was having a good conversation with a friend here in Fayetteville, an officer in the Army, he's Special Forces, and we were just kind of fleshing out some of the language. Because what I've realized for my focus missionaries, for my college students, and by the way, can you hear that chewing sound? No.
Yeah,
Okay.
for your dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. Actually, let me, Charvel, careful.
You want me to get him out of here?
Yeah, if you could. Let me just put him. My mom's sitting over here. Yeah,
As long as it's the dog chewing, not you.
Not no, I'm just trying to get out of the camera. All right. So, anyways, I was talking with the officer, and we were just kind of brainstorming some of the language. Not saying that one position over another is right or wrong. I think even more important than that is trying to understand the framework before we even get into evaluating the relative merits of positions on the reopening of churches. Because right now, I think the big challenge is many people are thinking they're very short-sighted. So they're thinking we need to be all safe or we need to accommodate people, but they're not reflecting on, well, what are the second and third order effects? How are we going to enforce these rules? What's the formal and informal compliance? How is that going to look in a month or two? How's that going to look in 3 months? I think a lot of parishes, they don't have that foresight. Does that make sense, Alana?
Yep, it totally makes sense. And it's kind of uncharted territory for a lot of us. So thinking it through and is important to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you could also, by the way, Alana, go on Facebook and just see if comments are. And folks, you can leave comments. We might not be able to respond on Twitter or YouTube as quickly, but on Facebook, definitely we're gonna be able to respond. So let us know what you're thinking. The Catholic link, we might not be able to respond as much on that. But yeah, so let's jump in. So let's talk about, first of all, the first principle we need to get at when it comes to, and I'm kind of hoping, I had asked Alana, if she can't do it, I understand, is to maybe write some of this up afterwards so that we can have like a written form for people to kind of digest. So the first distinction we want to make is there's the rules, right? And then there's the enforcement of the rules, and there's the compliance, right? So the first thing right out the gate we have to recognize, how does human behavior work? Most human behaviors, that bell curve really seems to be an effective way of understanding how people internalize things, right? So they often talk about there's thirds. So there's an early third called early adapters, right? You come out with something new, you come out with a new program, there's a new product. This is across most industries. You have your early adapters, people who are excited, they're gung-ho. So like, let's say you have really restrictive rules on mask wearing, whatever it might be, however you want to, there's going to be a core group of people, or not core group, there's going to be an early group of people that are going to be all about it. They're going to be your early adapters. They're going to be enthusiastic about it. These are the people that run out to get the first phones or whatever. I mean, not all, the early adapters will depending on the circumstances. Then you have a second group that might be a little bit more hesitant, that you might have to convince, and they're going to be the majority of people that are going to be more neutral. And then you're going to have a small group that's going to be really obstinate, disagreeing, and they're really not, they may not ever come around to the change that you're trying to bring. So I think that first distinction, that bell curve, is incredibly important for us to understand as leaders, as parishioners, as people who are trying to implement these changes. Just because you make a rule, that first Sunday, a majority of people, probably half of people, may not comply right off the bat. Does that make sense, Alana?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then what have you seen? You guys are now in Idaho. You're 4 weeks in. That bell curve has been kind of accurate about the situation there?
There's also a bell curve because I live in an area where there's multiple parishes and every parish is doing something different. There's also in that bell curve, there's parishes in the different areas of the bell curve. So it's a very interesting perspective to have versus a very rural area with only one church. So you either comply or you don't comply. Either you go to mass or you don't go to mass. So there's definitely that perspective too, where I've seen multiple different parishes do different things on the spectrum in this way.
Well, and let's look at it also like how much there's buy-in on the rules, right? So your political views, your understanding of the data, your understanding of the risks. There's going to be different people who have different views towards your rules. So think of it like speeding, right? Many of us generally don't view the speeding rules as that serious because most people are willing to speed at 5 to 10 miles over the speed limit, right? And there's that minority of folks that are willing to travel 100 miles an hour or so on and so forth. And how, just think of how difficult it is to enforce things like speeding rules and other dynamics in the public square when you have the rules.
Mm-hmm.
So just that's like a first thing to consider. I don't think we have to say a whole lot more about that, right? I think that concept. I think it's important to have the concept in your mind. So like even if like let's say you're all in on your rules and you're all in on your procedures at your parish, and your pastor, you agree with them. There's going to be people who disagree, and then there's just going to be how are you going to go about enforcing these rules? And that's where we're going to get into the formal and informal compliance, and then get into second and third order effects, and how the perception that you give and the vibe that you put out there is going to have huge consequences, right?
Absolutely.
So formal and informal compliance. So there's the formal one where you, the leaders, your key volunteers, your ushers, your staff, they enforce the rules and they reinforce them, and they talk with people. So let's say you have a rule that everybody has to wear a mask. So let's say you have the ushers and they have a plan that they have extra masks they're going to give to people if they don't. Or you're going to have a rule. I'm not evaluating this as a good rule or a bad rule. You have a rule that you don't provide masks. So if they don't have a mask, they can't come in. Okay. How's that going to look, right? So you're going to turn people away. Not evaluating it. If that's your rule, let's just look at it objectively. Try to take away our personal preference out of this. Okay. So, well, then you're going to build in an informal culture that you're going to have a certain number of parishioners who are going to take it upon themselves to enforce the rules. So let's say somebody is in mass and they maybe they're uncomfortable. They start to take off their mask, right? Because they're really uncomfortable and they need to breathe or whatever. What's that person next to them going to do now that you've created that climate that you throw people out for not wearing a mask? What is that going to look like? And then just take into account all of the personalities that are involved, right? So you have the little old lady who might have strong opinions about things or be afraid. Is she going to like yell at the teenager who takes off their mask? How's it going to look for a family when their kids are struggling with the masks and not wanting to wear them? And let's say the kid's coughing, just to throw it in there. How are people going to respond in that environment around them? Of course, my dog's now choosing the time to play. That's of course. But I mean, does that make sense with the?
Yeah, and it's something that I don't know if anybody's had to deal with yet. I think most people who are going to the places who have fairly strict rules are the ones who agree with the rules and are willing to comply. Those are the people who are already there.
Gotcha. So yeah, which would be different in our area, which is we don't have many options. Actually, right now for indoor mass, there's only one option. There's a few other options, but we're the biggest option for like an hour distance. So that'll be interesting, the differences between places where they have tons of options versus areas where there's few options.
Right.
Play out.
Right.
Okay.
So there's a lot of people who are still doing the virtual mass, either because they can't wear a mask. Our parish is fairly strict, so if they can't wear a mask, or if they know their children won't keep a mask on, then they're not going to mass, or they're going to a different parish that doesn't have required those as specific requirements. It's based on your own personal needs.
And then we'll get into what are the second, third order effects of that, right? So you get a family that gets out of the habit of going to mass. What is the likelihood that they're going to reignite that habit in a month or two or longer? Because we're not sure right now. I mean, has any parish given any indication when they're going to change their policies at all?
No.
No. So for the foreseeable future, for at least the summer, we're looking at very strict rules in some of these places, which
Right.
in the long term discourage and get people out of the habit of going to mass, right? Because
And there
you,
are some on the other end of the spectrum that don't require masks. So those are where people who are struggling with a mask situation go. And then there's also times when the people who are high risk that's their time to go to mass. So it's a very interesting way of how different people in different areas of our um, kind of suburbia are handling it. So
and this is where I would say one of the things I'm a strong advocate for when it comes to policies is what I would call realism, which is that instead of trying to shape human behavior, statistically, if a majority of people, like a majority of people are going to act in fairly predictable ways. And I think there's some views where it's like, because the way, like, for example, Catholic moral theology works is we don't go by what statistically majority of people do, right? So for example, for a majority of people, chastity might be a really hard thing, right? But we kind of call people to a higher calling with moral theology, which is generally a good thing for moral theology. I don't know if it's a good thing for church policies that have no intrinsic moral quality, right? So whether you wear a mask or not wear a mask doesn't make you immoral or moral one way or another. And I think there's people on both sides that can argue the relative merits of the position, but it's not a mortal sin to not wear a mask, right? And it's not going to necessarily hurt your immortal soul whether you wear a mask or not wear a mask. So, and those elements, things like air conditioning, elements of a parish experience, which are not intrinsically moral one way or another, they follow behavior patterns that we see with like restaurants, or we see with fast food, or we see with other services, which is if you have an uncomfortable experience, the second and third order effects are if you have an uncomfortable experience, you're less likely to return to that place, right? So like if you're uncomfortable and self-conscious the whole time, your desire, your motivation to go there is going to be greatly diminished, right?
yes, yeah, absolutely.
And that's where we get into the second and third order effects. So the second order effects, let me pull up the definition. It was a good definition that we developed. Second order effects, unplanned and unexpected consequences directly tied to specific actions. So in your case, you've already seen it with some of the parishes. You have very restrictive things. You have to wear masks and other restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
Very immediately, you lose a certain percentage of the population. Attendance drops quickly.
Right. And there's two reasons for that. Some people are still not comfortable coming out, or some people are not comfortable with the amount of restrictions. So there's both ends of the scale, I think, in our situation, our particular situation. Absolutely. Because you have to have your temperature taken, you have to have a mask, you have to sanitize your hands before you go in, you have to stay 6 feet away from anybody. It's, quite the gauntlet.
Yeah. And it overall makes the experience uncomfortable and self-conscious. So there might be an incentive not to come back. Because I've experienced this with, trying to think something I experienced this with. We experience this all the time, right? If there's something that's uncomfortable, you have to overcome your aversion for it. And yeah. And then the other dynamics, because I was talking about this earlier with somebody who's a friend of mine who works for the diocese. We were talking about a lot of times people like to go to mass because of the comfort that they find, the consolation they find. And of course you say, well, it's deeper than that. Agreed, 100%. But just objectively, you're going to lose a lot of those people if the experience is so uncomfortable that they get no consolation out of it. Yeah.
And my personal experience is that my body goes immediately into the fight or flight response when I have a mask on. So being in the reality that is mass and feeling fight or flight is extremely difficult to process in the moment, like knowing, like, I know that Jesus in the Eucharist, I know what's happening here, and I know it because I've studied it, right? So it's not normal experience. Like, I know this, but my body is telling me that I should be afraid and that I can't breathe. So that experience is really, it makes me struggle to be there, right? And personally, I'm like, okay, well, if this is what I have to do to receive Jesus, and like, that's kind of my mind where I am right now, where it's just like, okay, well, if this is what I need to do and to sacrifice to receive Jesus, then that's, what I'm going to be doing. But
Here's the thing though, to do that on a consistent basis, you have to have a really strong will, similar to somebody who's able to fast or somebody who's able to deal with profound discomfort, right? Because that's the thing, is you're gonna have to push through discomfort. And just think about that, how hard that can be. Like, let's say you say that now, you haven't been to mass in months, and like you're excited to be back and the motivation is high. But in a month or two, let's say you're having a bad day or a bad week and your kids are complaining and your spouse is complaining. They're like, can't we just stay at home? You might, in a moment of weakness, be like, you know what? I don't have the obligation to go on Sunday. We're just not going. We'll just live.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that temptation will be very real. I mean, assuming that we need to even encourage people to go back to mass at all. And maybe you take the position that, oh, well, then just live stream it. Okay, well, how is that going to look long-term for our young people? Another point that somebody brought out. So let's get into third order effects. And then one last part that I think will be good to talk about is the third order effects is the overall culture and the long-term health of the institution. So if right now we create a hyper-vigilant environment or even a lax environment, however you want, what are going to be the long-term effects on the community, right? Like, how will that affect things positively or negatively in the long term? So for example, if I don't know. What are your thoughts on that initially?
I think long term, it will depend on how they approach. Personally, I think it'll depend on how they approach religious education and how they approach meeting again in the parish buildings outside of mass at the same time, and how they welcome people who are wanting to convert because of this situation, right? They come to Christ because of this, what they experienced. How are they welcoming new people in, as well as making people feel comfortable on both spectrums? That's the thing, is that there's so many feelings on either end that it's hard to serve everyone in the way that they want to be served when it comes to religion. Does that make sense?
No, it's perfect. No, I think that's a great way to think about it. And I would say to somebody is, who is your target audience is something, that's the last point. And then I want to flesh out a few examples. I talked about Coca-Cola. Did I give that example yet? The Coca-Cola?
Yeah. You told me yesterday, but you can.
I haven't here today.
Not today.
That again, what is your target audience, right? So think about this. Teenagers and young adults already are not in the habit of going to church. And generally speaking, they struggle with that. They struggle to find church meaningful. And it's kind of almost like a developmental thing. It's not because we're doing a bad job necessarily. A lot of times it's just that kids are very physical. They're very pleasure oriented. They have to learn to overcome their desire for pleasure and learn to appreciate spiritual realities that can sometimes be challenging, right? Hearing the word of God, concentrating in prayer. These are things that, generally speaking, young people have a hard time with, even when they're profoundly motivated, which is something most people don't realize. There are a lot of teenagers and young adults who really want to be religious, they want to be devout, and they still struggle with paying attention in mass or finding mass, getting something out of mass, right? That's a challenge for them. I think it's a developmental task. I don't think it's necessarily we're doing anything wrong necessarily, depends on the parish, but it's just a developmental task. So if they're our focus, first of all, they're the least likely to get sick, but they're the most likely to leave the church at this time and to get out of the habit of going to church and to fight their parents and whatever. Right now, it seems like if you're more restrictive, your target audience is folks in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, some people have pointed out they are also the people that tend to donate more and to give more money, which does, I mean, that's a factor, right? I mean, you gotta pay bills. But the question I would ask anybody is, well, who's your long-term goal? Who are you really investing in? Because the reality is also with the older folks, they're more likely to come back as well. I mean, I would say they're more likely to be back in a month or two, whereas your younger audience might not.
Well, they already have the older generation already has a working memory of going to church, all of the, you know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
they have a lifelong working memory of church on Sunday. So 2 months of not being able to go doesn't completely rewrite their habits.
Yeah.
Where in the younger generations, it's become harder and harder in general to just get out of the house in this situation, which I think I talked to you about yesterday.
Yeah.
How even if I want to go somewhere, I'm just like, no, I just don't want to go. Like, and that's hard. And so it's like people who aren't used to going to mass or who struggle normally going to mass it's going to be even harder to get them to come. So it's going to be hard.
That makes perfect sense. I think that's the challenge. And with the kids is we're fighting against phones, which are for kids like crack. They love them, right? We're fighting against entertainment. We're fighting against all kinds of things that are way more enjoyable and demand less of them than church. And then if we add extra demands, how's that going to affect them? And how's that going to affect their experience of mass for the future? Where when they grow up, mass is a profoundly uncomfortable thing where everybody's afraid. That's good. That's going to create issues, right?
Yeah, especially the fear aspect. And also because there is a perspective on some people, not all young people, but some people are like, what is the least I have to do? Mm-hmm. Like, that's kind of like, what is the least I have to do to be a part of this? And that's what their goal is. And right now, the least they have to do is still not go to church. Like they're dispensed. They don't have to. It's not a mortal sin to miss mass right now. So
which could be somewhat debatable, but yeah, the physical obligation to be there, but still worship on Sundays still.
Right. Yeah. You still have to
worship God on Sunday.
Worship God.
But that's a little tricky, but yeah.
Yeah. But even watching mass online is not mandatory.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is that's what we have to battle against right now. Mm-hmm. How will that affect the younger generation? How will it affect the older generation that feel like, well, maybe I don't have to go to mass. I can just watch, like it's just easier for me to watch it online. And, but there's a parish here who is not even open yet. So it's like, how are these people all handling the different ways that their parishes are going through this? And, what is their level of desire? Does that make sense? Like their level of interaction with a parish. We actually have a comment with a question. Can I go say it? It says, can you also give advice on how to speak with a pastor who is still keeping everything closed? No mass, no confession. Do parishioners try to express their wants and needs for the sacrament?
Yes, over and over again. Respectfully, politely, consistently.
Yeah.
It works. And then your priest is going to tell you it doesn't work. Your bishop's going to tell you it doesn't work. And I can tell you it works. Maybe I should have said that out loud that way. But don't quote me on that. Don't quote me on that. But it definitely works. And it's generally discouraged because it does work.
Right. Well, and charitably.
Sure. Yeah.
With love.
Even charitable works, but but just please don't fall into mortal sin writing your pastor for your bishop. But yes, consistently, patiently, consistently, charitably, but consistently. Yeah. And don't ever quote me on that. Don't ever.
It's online.
Yeah,
the internet's forever, Father Ian.
How many priests and bishops follow our whole live stream? Probably a goose egg. So just don't quote me on that. I said it. I'll stand by it if I have to, but Because I've had a few situations where people are like, well, don't encourage people to give feedback because it isn't really effective. And everybody always says that, and they even mentally say that to themselves. But I will say, from experience, bull honky, it's always effective. It's always effective.
I think I agree with that. I think the reason why it's probably not encouraged is because there's usually a subset of people who are loud, and then other people who aren't loud and who don't have like more extreme feelings, like don't say anything. So that's all they'll hear if it's encouraged. Does that make sense?
No, I mean it makes sense a little bit, but I think more of it's just a human tendency. It's uncomfortable. I mean, I don't enjoy feedback necessarily. I encourage it constantly. It always like, I mean, I would love to tell you that when you send that concerned text at like 9 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and I'm like, ooh, thank you so much. But I'm not. I'm like, oh, dang it. And then, of course, I don't tell you that. Maybe I shouldn't be saying it out loud right now. But my first reaction is like, dang it, I don't want to hear from people. But I know long term it's better to hear from people, so I encourage it.
Yeah. And I think your best content is always like, I shouldn't be saying this out loud. And then you say it out loud. But I mean, because it's real. And that's what I think that's one of the reasons people follow you in particular in our conversations, that we say some things that, maybe shouldn't be said out loud, but they're real feelings. And that's how you really deal with them. Yeah. And that's what people are looking for, the reality of
telling people the behind the scenes kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's never fun. It's never fun to be critiqued or be called into question. This is where I joke around that I want to rewrite the Nada section of St. John of the Cross for priests and for pastors and leaders, which is endeavor to be inclined always not to the easiest, but to the most difficult, not to what means rest, but what means hard work, not to what is comfortable, but to what is uncomfortable. And if you can do that on a consistent basis, it's much better in life. It's hard to do. And yes, feedback's always uncomfortable.
Yep.
And it works. Even on me. It's worked the past week. And maybe I shouldn't be telling people that. I'm going to tell people on Sunday, especially people I disagree with. It works because I know these people. And like, I care about them. Like, it's not
right. It's not clergy against the laity battle that some people try to make it out to be, but it's really, you want to care for your people, and how you know how to do that is also them telling you, like, this is how I want to be cared. This is what I need for my spiritual care. It's important to have that dialogue.
I mean, I'm of the mind right now that we don't force max. We do minimal. We just take the risk. We bite the bullet. We do as little as possible. That's my position. But I have a lot of parishioners who don't agree with that position, and they've been talking with me about it. And yes, it has worked. And it's gotten me thinking, how can I meet their needs? How can I take into account their perspective and not completely dismiss them? And now I will say this, when you're giving feedback, consider this. Honey goes better than vinegar, right? It's the classic saying. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. I think, is that the saying?
Something like that, yes.
My mom's saying this, yes. My mom's right over here, by the way.
Yeah. But then I usually get the reply with, you also catch more flies with dung, so you got to be careful.
Well, yeah. Well, and there is something to be said even for like anger, which is, I mean, from a pastoral perspective, if like somebody's going to really fight you hard on something, you might be more gun shy ticking them off. Or you might just completely tune them out.
Right.
But
it depends on who the loudest people are. Is sometimes how you have to respond, which is really difficult. And sometimes you just have to, stand your ground.
Something else to consider, we don't like talking about it in church politics. There is such thing as power, right? So within a parish, there's power dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you got to kind of know where you stand on the totem pole. Like if you're low on the totem pole and you don't have much influence, talk to somebody who does have influence, right? So don't always go directly to the pastor. Like let's say that there's a deacon or there's a lay person who has a lot of influence with the pastor. Before you go to the pastor or an associate or whoever, before you go directly to the pastor, talk to them what's going on. Because even sometimes like some insider information can help. Like this is, I'm not thinking of anybody in particular with this example, but let's say your pastor is very restrictive and says, I don't want to have public masses. Let's say you talk to one of his inside cabinet people, his insiders, and they say, well, you know, Father right now is really sick. And like his doctors are telling him that if he gets sick, he's going to die. Oh, got it. So maybe there's a health concern. So even if you say, like, however you, when you just employ a little bit of empathy, even if you're still having your position, it can go a long way.
Your battery's going to die.
It is going to go. Let's see, where does it say? Okay, so we got a second. All right, I'm going to leave with this last thought. I wanted to talk to Pepsi, Coke. When we're thinking about second and third order effects, think about this for a second. Let's say you love Coca-Cola. It's your favorite drink. But Coca-Cola comes out with a new rule. You have to sign your signature. You have to give a code every time you buy a Coke. And let's say Pepsi, all you have to do is pay $1. What's going to happen long term, right? You're going to start buying Pepsi. It's like the path of least resistance. So we have to be aware of that if we set up too many roadblocks and too many obstacles, people might just shut down or go elsewhere. And that's just something to consider.
Yep, absolutely.
This is a good conversation, 45-minute conversation. Yeah, I think. Any closing thoughts, Alana?
Just, I think you actually have a comment here. It says that the difference is that you care about them and that you tell them you care about them. And I think maybe people aren't hearing that.
Yeah.
So maybe if priests do listen to this, that to make that working memory known, just that they're being cared for, and if their needs aren't being met spiritually, then maybe they do need to like say like, hey, I would like this, nicely, in charity, go about it in a way that doesn't create politics or division. So that's what I'd say about that. Great
stuff. That's great. That's a great closing point. Well, and you get a sense that when somebody cares about you and that they're interested in you.
Right.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Alana, if you just consider, I'll talk with you off camera about this. If we try to have like a written resource or whatever, we can think about that and brainstorm. But we can talk about that. We'll talk about it off camera. All right. Yep. Sorry. Put you on the spot. All right. Okay.